Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. Today, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book number 66, and it is titled Crimes of the Borgias. Apparently written by Alexander Dumas and edited by H.M. Tichenor. Let's see if we have a copyright date. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And this time we don't. Okay. Oh, Crimes of the Borgias. Alexander Dumas, edited by H.M. Tichenor. Here we go. Towards the end of the 15th century, that is to say, at the epoch when our history opens, the plaza of St. Peter's at Rome was far from presenting so noble an aspect as that which is offered in our own day to anyone who approaches it by the Piazza del Rusticucisi. At the same, on the 9th of August, 1492, the whole of Rome, from the People's Gate to the Colosseum, and from the baths of Diocletian to the Castle of St. Angelo, seemed to have made an appointment on this plaza. The multitude thronging it was so great as to overflow into all the neighboring streets, which started from this center like the rays of a star. Now all this multitude had its eyes fixed on one single point in the Vatican. For in the Vatican was the conclave, and as Innocent the Eighth has been dead for 16 days, the conclave was in the act of electing a pope. The eyes of the multitude were fixed upon the Vatican, and particularly upon one chimney, from which would come the first signal, when suddenly, at the moment of the Ave Maria, that is to say, at the hour when the day begins to decline, great cries went up from all the crowd, mixed with bursts of laughter, a discordant murmur of threats and raillery, the cause being that they had just received at the top of the chimney a thin smoke, which seemed like a light cloud to go up perpendicularly into the sky. The smoke announced that Rome was still without a master, and that the world was still without a pope. For this was the smoke of the voting tickets which were being burned, a proof that the cardinals had not yet come to an agreement. About this time, a man wrapped in a cloak stood up like a ghost against one of the columns of the completed basilica, and gliding slowly and carefully among the stones which lay lying about round the fountains of the new church, advanced as far as the fountain which formed the center of the piazza, erected in the very place where the obelisk is now set. When he reached this spot, he stopped doubly, concealed by the darkness of the night and by the shade of the monument, and after looking round him to see if he were really alone, drew his sword, and with its point rapping 3 times on the pavement of the piazza, each time made the sparks fly. This signal, for signal it was not lost. The last lamp which still kept vigil in the Vatican went out, and at the same instant an object thrown out of the window fell a few paces off from the young man in the cloak. He, guided by the silvery sound it made in touching the flags, lost no time in laying his hand upon it in spite of the darkness, and when he had it in his possession, hurried quickly away. Thus the unknown walked without turning round, halfway along the Borga Vecchio. But there he turned to the right and took a street at the other end of which was set up a Madonna with a lamp. He approached the light and drew from his pocket the object he had picked up, which was nothing else than a Roman crown piece. But this crown, unscrewed, and in a cavity hollowed in its thickness, enclosed a letter which the man to whom it was addressed began to read at the risk of being recognized. So great was his haste to know what it contained. He did not stand there long, for scarcely had he finished the letter when he replaced it in its silver receptacle, and readjusting his cloak so as to hide the lower part of his face, resumed his walk as far as the church of Regina Coeli. When he arrived at this place, he gave 3 rapid knocks on the door of a house of good appearance, which immediately opened. Then, slowly mounting the stairs, he entered a room where 2 women were awaiting him, with an impatience so unconcealed that both, as they saw him, exclaimed together, "Well, Francesco, what's news?" "Good news, my mother. Good news, my sister. Our father has gained 3 votes today, but he still needs 6 to have the majority." "Then there is no means of buying them?" "Certainly, my mother, certainly." And so it happened that 2 days later, Cardinal Asensio Sforza made the following proclamation to the Roman populace: "I announce to you a great joy. The most eminent and most reverend Signor Rodrigo Lanzulo Borgia, Archbishop of Valencia, Cardinal Deacon of San Nicola in Carissiri, Vice-Chancellor of the Church, has now been elected Pope, and has assumed the name of Alexander VI. Rodrigo Borgia had the reputation of a desolate man, but liberalism had mounted the papal throne with Sixtus IV and Innocent VIII, so that for the Romans there was nothing new in the singular situation of a pope with a mistress and 5 children. There had also grown up in Cardinal Borgia the talent for hypocrisy, which made of him the most perfect incarnation of the devil that has perhaps ever existed. Caesar Borgia, son of the new pope, learned the news of his father's election at the University of Pisa, where he was a student. He hastened to Rome with certain of his friends, and went straight to the Pope to kiss his feet. His Holiness received Caesar with a gracious countenance. Still, he did not allow himself any demonstration of his parental love. After this audience, Caesar left the Vatican and hurried to his mother. Rosa Venosa, mistress of Pope Alexander, possessed all the vices and all the virtues of a courtesan. Lucrezia Borgia, wife of Giovanni Sforza, was with her mother when her brother Caesar arrived. These 2 exchanged a loving-like kiss beneath their mother's very eyes, and before he left, Caesar had made an appointment with Lucrezia, who was now living apart from her husband, to whom Rodrigo paid a pension, in her palace of the Via del Pellegrini, and in there enjoying entire liberty. For a year after he mounted the papal throne, Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, made great strides in the extension of his temporal power. In his own hands he held, to be sure, only the least in size of the Italian territories, but by a marriage of his daughter Lucrezia, who had become divorced from Sforza, with the Lord of Pizarro, who was stretching out one hand as far as Venice, while by the marriage of his son, the Prince of Squilius, with Donna Sanchia, he was touching with the other hand the boundary of Calabria. He made Caesar Cardinal of Santa Maria Novella, as there was no precedent in church history for a bastard donning the scarlet. The Pope found 4 false witnesses who declared that Caesar was the legitimate son of Count Ferdinand of Castile. The wedding of the 2 bastards was most splendid, rich, with the double pomp of church and king, as the Pope had settled that the young bridal pair should live near him, Caesar Borgia, the new cardinal, undertook to manage the ceremony of their entry into Rome, and Lucrezia desired on her part to contribute all the splendor she had it in her power to add. Thus writes Tommaso Tommasi, by the look of the assembly and the sort of conversation that went on for hours, you would suppose you were present at some voluptuous royal audience of ancient Assyria, rather than at the severe consistory of the Roman pontiff, whose solemn duty it is to exhibit in every act the sanctity of the name he bears. Thus writes the master of the ceremonies in his journal. The Pope made his entry into the church of the Holy Apostle, and beside him, on the marble steps of the pulpit, where the canons of St. Peter are wont to chant the epistle and the gospel, sat Lucrezia, his daughter, and Sansia, his son's wife. Round about them, a disgrace to the church and a public scandal, were grouped a number of other Roman ladies, far more fit to dwell in Messalina's city than in St. Peter's. One day, shortly after his father's elevation to the papal throne, Caesar Borgia sent for his most trusted servant, Micheletto. Caesar received him, leaning against a tall chimney piece, no longer wearing his cardinal's robe and hat, but a doublet of black velvet slashed with satin of the same color. One hand toyed mechanically with his gloves, while the other rested on the handle of a poisoned dagger, which never left his side. This was the dress he kept for his nocturnal expeditions, so Micheletto felt no surprise at this. But his eyes burned with a flame more gloomy than their wont, and his cheeks, generally pale, were now livid. Micheletto had but to cast one look upon his master to see that Caesar and he were about to share some terrible enterprise. Caesar signed to him to shut the door. Micheletto obeyed. Then, after a moment's silence, during which the eyes of Borgia seemed to burn into the soul of the bravo, who with a careless air stood bareheaded before him, he said in a voice whose slightly mocking tone gave the only sign of his emotion, "Micheletto, how do you think this dress suits me?" "Admirably, Monsignor. Thanks to the dress. Your Excellency has the appearance, as well as the true spirit, of a captain." "I am glad you think so," replied Caesar. "And now, let me ask you, do you know who is the cause that, instead of wearing this dress, which I can only put on at night, I am forced to disguise myself in the daytime in a cardinal's robe and hat, and pass my time trotting about from church to church, from consistory to consistory, when I ought properly be leading a magnificent army in the battlefield, where you would enjoy a captain's rank instead of being the chief of a few miserable sbirri, S-B-I-R-R-I, sbirri?" "Yes, Monsignor," replied Micheletto, who had divined Caesar's meaning at his first word. "The man who is the cause of this is Francesco, Duke of Gandia, your elder brother. Do you know," Caesar resumed, "who has all the money and none of the genius, who has the helmet and none of the brains, who has the sword and no hand to wield it?" "That, too, is the Duke of Gandia," said Micheletto. "Do you know," continued Caesar, "who is the man whom I find continually blocking the path of my ambition, my fortune, and my love?" "It is the same, the Duke of Gandia," said Micheletto. "And what do you think of it?" said Caesar. "I think he must die," replied the man coldly. "This is my opinion also, Micheletto," said Cardinal Caesar Borgia, stepping towards him and grasping his hand, "and my only regret is that I did not think of it sooner. For if I had carried a sword at my side instead of a kreuzer in my hand when the King of France was marching through Italy, I should now have been master of my fine domain. The Pope is anxious to aggrandize his family, but he is mistaken in the means he adopts. It is I who ought to have been made duke, and my brother a cardinal. The man who would make his way to vast domains in the kingdom ought to trample underfoot all the obstacles in his path. Such a man, if he would open out his path to fortune, should seize his dagger and strike out with his eyes shut. He should not shrink from bathing his hands in the blood of his kindred. He should follow the example offered him by every founder of empire from Romulus to Bajazet, Bajazet, both of whom climbed the throne by the ladder of fratricide. Yes, Micheletto, as you say, such is my condition, and I am resolved I will not shrink. Now you know why I sent you. Am I wrong in counting upon you? Micheletto, seeing his own fortune in this crime, replied that he was entirely at Caesar's service, and that he had nothing to do but to give his orders as to time, place, and manner of execution. Caesar replied that the time must needs be very soon, since he was on the point of leaving Rome for Naples. As to the place and mode of execution, they would depend on circumstances, and each of them must look out for an opportunity and seize the first that seemed favorable. 2 days after this resolution had been taken, Caesar learned that the day of his departure was fixed for Thursday, the 15th of June. At the same time, he received an invitation from his mother to come to supper with her on the 14th. Pardon me. Hydration. The table was set in the open air in a magnificent vineyard, a property of Rosa Venosa's, in the neighborhood of San Pierre in Vincolis. The guests were Caesar Borgia, the Duke of Gandia, the Prince of Squillace, Donna Sancha, the Cardinal of Monterey, Francesco Borgia, son of Pope Calixtus III, Don Rodrigo Borgia, captain of the Apostolic Palace, Don Giuffrido, brother of the Cardinal, Gian Borgia, ambassador at Perugia, and lastly, Don Alfonso Borgia, the Pope's nephew. The whole family, therefore, was present, except Lucretia. In the middle of the feast, a man in a mask brought the Duke of Gandia a letter. The Duke opened it, coloring up with pleasure, and when he had read it, answered, "I will come." Then he quickly hid the letter in the pocket of his doublet, but not before Caesar had had time to cast a glance that way. And though he recognized the handwriting of his sister Lucretia, at that point it was the custom for love messages to be conveyed by men in disguise, or by women whose faces were concealed by a veil. At 10 o'clock they rose from the table, and as the air was mild, walked about under the pine trees that shaded the house, while Caesar never let his brother out of his sight. At 11 o'clock the Duke of Gandia bade good night to his mother. Caesar at once followed suit, alleging his desire to go to the Vatican to bid farewell to the Pope, his departure being fixed at daybreak. This pretext was all the more plausible since the Pope was in the habit of sitting up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The two brothers went out together, mounted their horses, and rode side by side as far as the Palazzo Borgia, a gift to Cardinal Sfosa from the Pope. There the Duke of Gandia separated from his brother, saying with a smile that he had several hours to spend with a fair lady who was expecting him. Caesar wished him happiness and a very good night. The Duke turned to the right and Caesar to the left, but Caesar observed that the street the Duke had taken led in the direction of the convent of San Sisto, where their sister Lucretia was at the time in retreat. Caesar's suspicions as to whom the lady was were confirmed by this observation. He directed his horse to the Vatican, found the Pope, and received his benediction. From this moment all is wrapped in mystery. Flipping page. Come on now. Okay, there we go. From this moment, all is wrapped in mystery and darkness, like that in which the terrible deed was done, that we are now to relate. This, however, is what is believed. The Duke of Gandia, when he quitted his brother the cardinal, sent away his servants, and in company of one confidential valet, alone pursued his course towards the Plaza della Giudizia. There he found the same man in a mask who had come to speak to him at supper, and forbidding his valet to follow any farther, he bade him wait on the piazza where they then stood, promising to be on his way back in 2 hours. 2 hours' time, at least, and to take him up as he passed. And at the appointed time the Duke reappeared, took leave this time of the man in the mask, and retraced his steps towards his palace. But scarcely had he turned the corner of the Jewish ghetto when 4 men on foot, led by a 5th, who was on horseback, flung themselves upon him, thinking they were thieves, or else that he was the victim of some mistake. The Duke of Gandia mentioned his name, but instead of the name checking the assassins' daggers, their strokes were redoubled, and the Duke very soon fell dead, his valet dying beside him. Then the man on horseback, who had watched the assassination with no sign of emotion, backed his horse toward the dead body. The 4 murderers lifted the corpse across the crouper, and walking by the side, supported, made their way down the lane that lends to the church of Santa Maria in Monticello. The wretched valet they left for dead upon the pavement. But he, after the lapse of a few minutes, regained some small stretch, and his groans were heard by the inhabitants of a house hard by. They came and picked him up and laid him on a bed, where he died almost at once, unable to give any evidence as to the assassins or any details of the murder. At night, the Duke was expected home, and all the next morning. At night, the Duke was expected home, and all the next morning. Then expectation was turned into fear, and fear at last into deadly terror. The Pope was approached and told that the Duke of Gandia had never come back to his palace since he left his mother's house, but the Pope tried to deceive himself all through the rest of the day, hoping that his son might have been surprised by the coming of daylight in the midst of an amorous adventure, and was waiting till the next night to get away in the darkness which had aided his coming thither. By the night, like the day, passed and brought no news. On the morrow, the Pope, tormented by the gloomiest presentiments, let himself fall into the depths of despair. Amid sighs and sobs of grief, all he could say was, "Search, search, let us know how my unhappy son died." Everybody joined in the search, but nothing could be discovered from scouring the city except the body of the Duke's valet. Of his master there was no trace whatever. It was then thought that he had probably been thrown into the Tiber, and they began to follow along its banks, questioning every boatman and fisherman who might possibly have seen what had happened on the river banks. At first, all inquiries were in vain, but when they had gone up as far as the Via del Fontenone, they found a man who said he had seen something happen on the night of the 14th. Page turn. Man, these pages are really brittle. On the night of the 14th. Which might have some bearing on the subject of inquiry. He was a Slav named George, who was taking a load of wood in a boat up the river. He told the following. "Gentlemen," he said, "last Wednesday evening, when I had uploaded my wood on the bank, I remained in my boat, watching lest others should come and take away the wood. About 2 o'clock in the morning I saw coming out of the lane on the left of San Giorgio's church 2 men on foot, who came forward into the middle of the street and looked carefully all around. When they felt that the street was deserted, they went back along the same lane, whence issued 2 other men. Next appeared 1 man on a dappled gray horse, which was carrying on the cupper the body of a dead man, his head and arms hanging over on one side and his feet on the other. The 2 men I had first seen were holding him up by the arms and legs. The other 3 went up the river, while the first 2 kept watch and advancing to where the sewers were discharged into the Tiber. The horseman turned his horse, backing on the river. Then the 2 men who were at either side, taking the corpse, one by the hands, the other by the feet, swung it 3 times, and the third time threw it into the stream. At the noise made when the body splashed into the river, the horseman asked, "Is it done?" And the man answered, "Yes, sir." And he turned right about face. But seeing the dead man's cloak floating, he asked what was that black thing swimming about. "Sir," said one of the men, "it is his cloak." And then one of them picked up some stones, and running to where it was floating, threw them so as to make it sink. As soon as it had disappeared, they went off and went into the lane that leads to San Giacomo. That was all I saw, gentlemen. One of the Pope's servants asked the Slav why, when he was witness of such a deed, he had not gone to denounce it to the governor. But the Slav replied that since he had exercised his present trade, he had seen dead men thrown into the Tiber 100 times and had never heard of anybody being troubled about them. So he supposed it would be the same with this corpse as with the others. Acting on this intelligence, the servants of His Holiness, the Pope, summoned all the boatmen who were accustomed to go up and down the river, and offered a large reward to anyone who would find the Duke's body. And before the evening of the same day, 2 men were drawn out of the water, of whom one was recognized as the Duke. There could be no doubt as to the cause of death. The body was pierced with 9 wounds, one in the throat cutting the artery. Meantime, the blood-stained hands of Cardinal Caesar Borgia were placing a royal crown upon the head of Frederick of Aragon. At first, the Pope did not know who to suspect. He gave orders for the pursuit of the murderers. But soon the truth was forced upon him. He realized that the blow which struck at the house of Borgia came from that very house itself, and his despair was changed to madness. He ran through the rooms of the Vatican like a maniac, and entering the consistory with torn garments and ashes on his head, he avowed all the sins of his past life, declaring that the disaster that had struck his offspring through another of his offspring was a punishment from God. He retired to a secret dark chamber of the papal palace, and there shut himself up, declaring to resolve to die of starvation. For more than 60 hours he took no nourishment. Even the beautiful Gallia Farnese, his new mistress, could not move him, and was obliged to send for his daughter Lucrezia. Hydrate. Excuse me. The Pope remained alone with Lucrezia for 3 days and nights. Then he reappeared in public, outwardly calm, if not resigned. For the writer, Guicciardini, assures us that Lucrezia had made him understand how dangerous it would be to himself to show too openly before Caesar, who was coming home, the affection he felt for Caesar's victim. Caesar Borgia remained a while at Naples, partly to give time for the Pope's grief to cool down, and partly to attend another business, which was nothing else than a proposition of marriage between his sister Lucrezia and Don Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, and Prince of Salerno, natural son of Alfonso II and brother of Donna Sancha. True, Lucrezia was already married a second time, But she was the daughter of a father who had received from heaven the right of uniting and disuniting. There was no need to trouble about so trifling a matter. When the two were ready to be married, the divorce would be effected. Pope Alexander was too good a statesman to leave his daughter married to a son-in-law who had become useless to him. Towards the end of August, it was announced that Caesar was coming back to Rome, and thither he returned on the 5th of September, nearly 3 months after the assassination of the Duke of Gandia. And on the next day, the 6th, from the church of Santa Maria Novella, where, according to custom, the cardinals and the Spanish and Venetian ambassadors were awaiting him on horseback at the door, he proceeded to the Vatican. Entering the consistory, he was admitted by the Pope and received his benediction and kiss. Then, accompanied once more by the ambassadors and cardinals, he was escorted to his own apartments. Thence he proceeded to the Pope's as soon as he was left alone. For at the consistory they had had no conversation with one another, and the father and son had 100 things to talk about. But of these the Duke of Gandia was not one. His name was not spoken, and neither on that day nor afterwards was there any mention of the murdered Duke. Caesar brought good news to the Pope. King Friedrich had given his consent to the proposed union, so the marriage of Sforza and Lucretia was dissolved on a pretext of nullity. After this, all came about as Caesar had desired. He became the man who was all-powerful after the Pope. But when he became second in power, it was soon evident to the Roman people that their city was making a new stride in the direction of ruin. There was nothing but balls, fetes, masquerades. There were gorgeous hunting parties in which Caesar Borgia, who had begun to cast off his cardinal's robe, appeared in a French dress, followed like a king by cardinals, envoys, and bodyguard. The holy city, given up like a courtesan to all kinds of orgies and debauchery, had never before seen such a home of sedition, luxury, and carnage, according to the Cardinal of Viterbo. Not even in the days of Nero and Heliogabalus. The gold was melting as in a furnace at these orgies. Pope Alexander and his son Caesar were beginning to covet the fortunes of those very men whom they had raised to their present social elevation. The first attempt at a new method of coining money was tried upon the Cardinal of Cosenza. The occasion was as follows. A certain dispensation had been granted some time before to a nun, who had taken the vows of chastity. She was the only surviving heir to the throne of Portugal, and by means of the dispensation she had been wedded to the natural son of the last king. This marriage was prejudicial to the interest of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. So they sent ambassadors to the Pope to lodge a complaint against a proceeding of this nature, especially as it happened at the very moment when an alliance was to be formed between the House of Aragon and the Holy See. Alexander appreciated the complaint and resolved that all should be set right. So he denied all knowledge of the papal brief, though he had as a fact received 60,000 ducats for signing it, and accused the Archbishop of Cosenza, secretary for apostolic briefs, of having granted a false dispensation, allowing the nun to marry. By reason of this accusation, the Archbishop was taken to the castle of St. Angelo, and a suit was begun. But as it was no easy task to prove an accusation of this nature, especially if the Archbishop should persist in maintaining that the dispensation was really granted by the Pope, it was resolved to employ a trick with him which could not fail to succeed. And with that, we're going to stop with part 1 of The Crimes of the Borgias, written by Alexander Dumas, edited by H.M. Tichenor. Thanks for listening, and join me.